Welcome to another episode of The Executive. We've got a real treat today, another space expert on the podcast, and Kelly Hennig, who is the COO of Stoke Space, who is doing just really incredible work in reusable rockets. And so excited to talk about what they're building, why that's so important, and sustainability, and why sustainability is even so important just to the space industry. So Kelly, so excited to have you on. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, Kelly, why don't you just start us off with a little bit about Stoke Space, kind of what you guys are building, and why do you care about sustainability and reusable rockets to start us off with?
We really need to get into space, and we have to our population is expanding at a rapid pace. It has been for years. We're growing exponentially. And the carrying capacity of the Earth is kind of reaching its limit. We're not, we don't have, any frontiers left to explore. And we just don't have the ability to keep putting factories and farms and other places. And so we really have to find a way in order to use our space efficiently and to essentially grow our ecosystem. And the place to do that would be space. And in order to be able to do that, you have to make space easily accessed, and you have to provide routine and low cost flights there for everybody to be able to do that. This enables us to put quite a bit of assets up there. They're low cost satellites that help with Earth observation, things like weather, pollution monitoring, help with resource allocation, or improving farming practices, or even, just simply for communications and other things like that just help us run our lives better and more efficiently. And so to do that, we really just have to democratize space and allow us to get up there. And following that, you want to do that in a way that minimizes the impact of the planet. So you don't want to have very high pollutants in rockets, whether it be solid rockets or using kerosene or other things like that. And you certainly don't want to leave anything behind once you're up there. So right now, low Earth orbit is filled with space debris from things people left behind. And so we're developing a fully reusable rocket that includes the first as well as the second stage. And most people throw away that second stage. We want to bring it down. And so that, again, eliminates any of the debris that you see beginning to pollute space.
And how did Stoke Space get started? I mean, how did the team get started on such a, what probably when you started was a kind of a crazy idea to be able to reuse these, right? It was a big enough deal just to get to space, and now we're talking about reusing these.
Yeah, sure. So it was started by Tom and Andy, and they are both rocket scientists. I'm not, so I get to say that. And they came from another place that is developing rockets. And they really wanted to move faster. And they saw that a number of our competitors aren't addressing the real problem that exists, which is how to drive down launch costs and how to make space access routine. And in order to do that, you need a fully reusable rocket. And the second stage has always been very problematic. How do you bring that down? How do you survive atmospheric reentry, which has terrible, terrible environments? And you can remember when we were flying the space shuttle, all of those ceramic tiles that were on it and how that protected it, how fragile they were,
Right.
how they could get easily damaged, how they had to be inspected and taken care of. And then once it's kind of lands, you actually have to cool it. So they have to attach a fire hose essentially onto it in order to be able to bring it down to a temperature so people can even approach it. So that, solution set has been tried for years, but it just wasn't providing the real sustainability options that we needed. So they came up with a fully reusable base heat shield, which is actively cooled. And they pulled on their experience in designing engines, which uses regenerative cooling within the combustion chamber in order to maintain the walls at a certain temperature so it doesn't melt. And they pulled from that, and they developed this heat shield that uses the same principles in order to be able to survive reentry and then rapidly reuse it.
And in terms of the reusability of these rockets, we've started to see this, I think, Blue Origin reused one of theirs. Eventually, is that where everything is going, where everyone will use reusable rockets? This will be a thing in the past of just one-time use. Is that where we're going?
I I honestly believe so,
Yeah,
and I absolutely hope so. It's funny because you think of aerospace, it's aviation and space, right?
right.
And we don't actually ask, why do you have reusable aircraft, right?
Yeah, it's
That
just common
question seems a
sense.
little bit
Yeah,
absurd.
right.
so, so when you think about, launch vehicles, why would that be any different? Why would you necessarily need to have something that you throw away as opposed to reusing? And so our goal is to make space launch very similar to commercial air flight, where you're continually flying and reusing the aircrafts, and it becomes more of a service as opposed to purchasing a launch vehicle.
And talking about Stoke Space more specifically, your team is known for moving incredibly fast. I think you're one of the fastest growing rocket companies out there, if not, I think the fastest. How is that your team, has done that? Is that a cultural thing? What is it your team is doing really well, to have that type of title associated with you?
Again, I have to credit the founders, Andy and Tom, on this. They were created a vision for the company, as well as a vision for the culture, the mission, the technology itself. And that culture has attracted very high caliber talent. And so we've been able to cherry pick because people are so willing to join the company. We've been really willing to able to cherry pick them and pull from the best. And once you have a team that is incredibly competent, you can trust them, and you can rely on them, and you can kind of work with them in order to go very, very fast. You really want people who match your passion.
Yeah.
So you want the founders to provide the passion. You really want people who can provide a similar match and enjoy the work and really push themselves. And so we feel that we've been able to really pick the cream of the crop as far as talent, and I think that has a lot to do with it.
And you have a big vision, so it's easy to pull people into that. What is it about the
Yeah,
culture that is so enticing to people? What is the culture?
I would say the culture is about trust, ownership, grit, integrity, all of the things that you commonly hear companies actually spout.
Yeah.
But I think here the leadership really embodies it. And when they're walking the walk and talking the talk, people pick up on it.
Yeah.
And they start to emulate it, and they start to hold each other accountable in those same aspects. And so you can't necessarily have a culture that you don't ensure is embodied from the absolute top down. And I think we have done a very good job of flowing it down and keeping it throughout the company.
Yeah, that's well said. And in terms of moving fast, obviously startups have to move fast. Sometimes that's the advantage. How do you move fast as an organization, especially in hard tech, right, where you don't want to make mistakes? You still need everything to be right. How do you make sure you have accuracy and move quickly?
Well, I think that's a misnomer. I think mistakes are fine.
Yeah.
I think you want to make mistakes. You want to iterate. So you want to do the bare minimum of analysis in order to get you to a phase where you can test,
Yeah.
and then you can learn. And then you can take that and incorporate it back into your design, and you'll have these cycles of learning that make the product so much better. There's so much that we can't understand and fully encompass in our simulations or in the formulas and all of the things during design practice. You really need to be able to test and build hardware. And so the idea is not necessarily that you don't make mistakes. The idea is that you make a mistake quickly, you learn from it, you adapt, and then you keep going.
Right. And it sounds like that's your culture. What did mistakes made, and that's what did you learn from it? Great. Let's adapt. Let's implement that.
Yes, and it goes a little bit back to the grit aspect of it, and because you have to be willing to fail, and you have to be willing to kind of pick yourself up. Yep, this design was wrong. I learned a lot from it. I'm going to keep going.
Yeah.
And I think everybody here embodies that overall mentality.
Well, I do want to click on one thing too, about your culture, because your team has done a great job of being where you're at for not being around that long, and you're moving quickly and you're scaling. But one thing that I heard about your team that you really value is outside of work. It's your family. It's being home on time. And I understand, you've done a really good job of that personally. You have 2 kids, is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
How is it, can you talk a little bit about that? How your company values life outside of work while having the craziness of a startup, and how do you guys do that?
Sure, I'll talk about that, but I'm not. I'm gonna couch my own experience with right now for a second, just because I don't want to be hypocritical. So
Yep.
I would say again, I'll go back to Tom and Andy. If you look at their Twitter profiles, you can see both of them list one of their who they are as being a dad,
Yep.
and I believe that they absolutely embody kind of the overall family culture. And what that essentially means is we've kind of shifted away from childcare and family to being a woman's issue and made it an overall family issue, and shifting the conversation away from it being maternity leave and it really just being family leave, and talking about that. And when you see powerful men taking paternity leave or going off to pick their kids up or staying home because they're sick or doing any of the things that you typically associate with mothers in the workplace, it has an incredibly powerful impact on your employees. And it has a huge impact on women employees. When I was an early career engineer, my managers had very, very successful wives. And so they had pickup and drop off duty for their kids, and they would leave, at 5 o'clock every day. And they would get in at 8 o'clock every day. And sometimes they would bring their kids in. And that had a profound impact on my overall assumption about what my work-life balance would be and what I would expect from folks. And so when people see that, it makes it very easy for them to copy it. And so the reason I couched my own personal experience is because I cheat right now. And so during the pandemic, me and my husband both worked at the same company. We were both
Okay.
at Northrop Grumman for a very long time.
Yeah.
And when the pandemic hit, we were both on site because our jobs required us to keep working on site. And when that happened, our kids weren't getting the support that they needed. And so we quickly determined that one of us needed to step back and stay with them and take care of them, making sure their needs were met. And so my husband offered to do it. And so it worked out so well. It was one of the best decisions we ever made. And so now my husband is a stay-at-home dad.
That's awesome.
Which is
Yeah.
why I say I cheat.
Yeah.
And I feel
yeah,
good.
I was going to say, he's sacrificed for the family, but it's hard to say it's a sacrifice when you get to spend so much, time with your kids too. It can be either.
He loves it, and
Yeah.
I love that he loves it, and it makes
Right.
it's such a relief to not have to worry about who's taking the kids to the doctor or they're sick today. How do we juggle that? And so it was really a huge relief, and I think it really improved our kids' lives. And it was just something that we personally needed, and so I don't think that this is something that is across the board. I think some families are a lot more resilient, and they've got it down. But I also don't want to misrepresent my own
No,
my own ability to multitask.
I think that's important to say, right? Because I think it's tough when people portray something else, right? Where they're in at 5 and leave at 7, and they're still great parents, and you're trying to do the math of how that works.
Exactly, and then you feel terrible
Right.
because you're like, oh my God, how come I can't do that, right?
Yeah.
No, so
No, I think that's important to say. And it's, again, what's interesting about your culture is just the leadership, right? The leadership sets the tone, and they're the ones that are saying, like, we're going to be taking care of our kids when they're sick, when they need us home, and we can still get our work done.
Yep.
Talking about you specifically, so you were at Northrop and Raytheon, large companies, much larger than Stoke, in your career. What made you leave maybe the comfort of a big company, if that's the right word, to being like, I'm going to go actually be the COO of this startup at the time, and still is?
So I met the founders, and I was really impressed by their leadership. I got to meet quite a few of the employees, and I was impressed by them. I loved the overall culture. And for me personally, in a large company like that, your ability to help people out and effectively make change is really hampered by the overall, huge machine that you have to go through and the bureaucracies you have to deal with. And I was a little bit frustrated that I couldn't make a bigger difference. And so here, I have quite a bit of freedom in order to help people out, make positive changes, implement policies that make sense, and just help out the people of the company to a much larger extent. And that's very satisfying to me.
You want to
do it quickly too, which is fun.
Right. You can have a bigger impact a lot quicker.
A lot quicker. Yeah. For example, we were very successful in one of our engine tests, and the leadership, me, Tom, and Andy got together, and we said, we should give our team another day before Thanksgiving, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, off, just to allow people to stay home with their family and celebrate with their family, because they've really been pushing it up to that point. And we were able to, we said, let's do it. And we just did it. Yeah. And we were so successful. Our team had really pushed themselves, had driven themselves. And we wanted to make sure that not only did they feel a benefit of it, but their families did as well, because their families are sacrificing in letting our employees be here and kind of pursue this work. So we wanted their entire families to kind of be able to take part in that. Really so cool. I was able to do that, just say, okay, I'm doing it. And that felt wonderful.
It's a little hard at Raytheon.
Oh my God, yes.
That might be a couple of years in advance.
Yes, I would say so.
I'm sure there were things, though, from those experiences that you learned a lot from. Are there certain things where you really try to take those experiences into Stoke because it was so valuable? What kind of experiences and lessons you're trying to take into Stoke as a startup?
I have a lot of, I would say, technical know-how about processes and how to get things done. But I want to be incredibly careful. I do not want to change the culture here, and I certainly don't want to bring any kind of bad habits with me and institute them here. And so I have to be incredibly careful about that. I would say most of the things I'm bringing is just more wisdom from having gone through and been with a large organization and see process and what works and what doesn't work. But I would say the natural evolution and growth is happening very organically. And I'm kind of trying hard to keep it moving, but trying very much not to imprint my own experiences over top of it. I think that's very important, especially for process. I think a lot of startups, especially space startups, will take a aerospace executive from one of these large old school aerospace corporations and put them in charge. And they come and they bring all of their processes that they've had and they institute them immediately. And the thing about those companies, and they've developed those processes through mistakes they've made. And you're working on something, you make a mistake and you say, oh my goodness, we can't have that happen again. Let's put something in place so that when we use it appropriately, we won't do that again. And that institutional knowledge and wisdom of when to apply that process appropriately and why the process exists is critical in order to be able to sometimes move fast and other times, produce products that can be used on flight. And when you pull from somebody like an old school executive and just put them in charge of a startup, and then they bring those processes with them, that institutional knowledge never transfers and that wisdom doesn't come with it. And so all you get is a bunch of processes people don't understand and don't know how to appropriately apply. Yeah. And so I have to be very careful that I don't do that, and I allow the same type of learning that occurs at those places to occur here, just guiding it and making that process more efficient.
Right. I'm sure that's hard, right? Because we're all creatures of habit, but you got to resist a little bit of the old ways.
So I'm told that I use very aerospace-y terms. and so sometimes I have to try very hard not to use the standard aerospace term to not freak people out. But But yes, I would say my nomenclature is the biggest issue, and I'm working on it.
Yeah, it takes time. Um, as you know, as a CEO, as you come in, where are your priorities? You know, what do you look at as like these are my main priorities in this type of position that I'm focused on, you know, at this stage of the company?
Right now, I see my main job is to make sure people, the individuals producing the product, the technicians, the machinists, the fabricators, the engineers, they have whatever they need in order to execute. And that they have it quickly, and that they can come to me at any point in time and just show up at my desk and say, Kelly, I have this issue. I need help. And my main job is to remove those roadblocks and set up things and put things in place essentially so they can do their job better. And so my priorities are designing processes that do not slow them down, but help them out, that streamline things and just allow them to focus and do their job. And so a lot of times, it's a little bit of fire,
Yeah,
putting out fire
sure.
mode, and responding to whatever issue comes up right at that point. But I need to be where the people are and kind of focused on what they need in order to get their jobs done.
And I'm curious to hear your workflow, right? Because there are so many fires during a day. Your to-do list goes out the window. You still have to think, you know, bigger picture. How do you manage your workflow from the millions of little tasks to I need to step aside and like just think about how to solve this and put some real thought into it?
So I would say those type of big picture thoughts I'm naturally drawn to,
Yeah.
and my mind kind of goes that direction in kind of a almost daydreamy type of mode. That's my default setting. So if I'm driving or walking somewhere or just grabbing lunch, I slip into that very quickly. So if there's not an immediate task in front of me, I
You just
kind of
start thinking about it.
naturally go. I
Yeah.
just
Starts
naturally go in
coming.
that
Yeah.
direction. And yes, exactly. And so I'm more of the type where I have to focus and ensure that I'm focused on the immediate task at hand. Otherwise, I do go into the what if kind of mode. I think I randomly send emails or Slack messages to folks saying, "Hey, what if we did
Right.
this?
They're like,
How would that
here's
work?"
another Kelly Slack. Here we go. Yep.
Yes, exactly.
Another idea is coming our way.
Here's another Kelly Slack idea that you just came up with.
Yep. We all have those people. They're the best though. Because sometimes they're like, no, we can't do it because of this reason, right? Or they're like, oh, I never thought of that.
Yes. Yes. And I would say I do not like being told no.
Yeah.
And no,
Right.
we can't do it. So typically if somebody says we can't do it, there's a lot of follow-ups.
Right. And
Why?
why? Yeah.
Why?
You take
Why?
the things your kids ask you, right? Where they're constantly like, why? And then they ask you why, and now
Yes.
you're like, actually, I don't know the reason anymore. It's no different.
Yes. Exactly. It breaks down at some point in
Yep.
time, and you get to it. But hopefully, when you work with people enough and they say, "Oh, if I tell Kelly no, she's immediately going to ask a bunch of whys."
Right. So,
I better head that off.
right. Let me cut this off now and give her the answer she's
Let me cut
looking
this off
for.
now.
Yeah. Throughout your career, has there been something where, piece of advice or maybe even an attribute that you really admire that you really try to include in your career that, you'd love to share, something that you've seen?
Sure. I don't know if this is advice or not, but it's not snazzy and it's not a tagline or anything else like that. But I am incredibly focused and driven, and I can be very aggressive, and I can blow right through people, and I don't even know that I'm doing it. I just drive, and this is it's great. It has its uses. But when I was leading my first team a long time ago, one of my mentors told me that I needed to slow down and make sure I brought people along with me and not leave them behind. Because if I didn't bring my people with me, I would fail. And so that is something that, he was absolutely right about. I took his advice. It worked, but I do have to keep remembering it. I have to keep remembering that I just can't have a singular focus and go off on my own and just focus on that goal. I have to make sure my entire team is coming with me, that I have their buy-in, and that they're engaged, and I've kind of sold them on the mission. Because if I don't have that team backing, I, I won't have their high performance, and I'll lose and fail.
And how do you do that? How do you bring people along?
There's a lot of transparency. There's a lot of discussions. There are a lot of making them feel like they are helping in the decision process. And there is a lot of overall me showing trust in them throughout it, as well as me showing vulnerability, that I need their help, that I don't understand everything. And there is a lot of explaining my position and why we're doing it and what I need from them. And so, and not even just explaining, there's listening to how can I, incorporate their feedback, and asking, what am I missing? Okay, we're going to do this. What am I missing, guys? Like, what have I completely neglected here?
Right.
And having them be a part of the overall process is huge, to getting their buy-in.
Yeah.
Even if you can't incorporate exactly what they said, and even if you go in a different direction, just knowing that they're part of the process itself, a lot of times, people they come.
Yeah, and that they were heard. So important. Coming back to just Stoke Space for just 1 minute, just because I'm curious to hear your vision for Stoke Space, the founder's vision of where you think Stoke Space is going, before we completely wrap up. But what is your prediction for where Stoke Space is heading? What is the ultimate vision of what you're trying to accomplish?
So both the near term goal is we're going to launch,
Yeah.
And we're going to be successful, and then we're going to have a fully reusable rocket. And a lot of right now, because access to space is so limited,
Yeah.
You find a number of satellite providers, who actually will aggregate all their satellites into one launch, and they'll put them all together, and they'll spend quite a bit of time actually, maneuvering to their final orbit. And we want to make, launch so routine and so commonplace that it's almost always available. So, they can look and say, I've designed it, I'm going to be ready. And then 2 weeks later, they say, oh, there's a launch coming up. I'm going to grab that one. And so we want to make it just so easy, and access to space just so routine that it becomes very similar to, air flights and following those types of models. So we want to see a complete shift into that direction. And I think we're going to do it. So that is the ultimate vision for where we're going.
It's amazing, isn't it, to think about how just launching into space can be in the future as commonplace as just, going from Florida to Texas, or,
I know.
Crazy to think that, hopefully the next generation starts to see that happen.
I hope so. We were all promised this. So I'm not going to date myself, but I'm going to say a long time ago.
Flying
There's
cars.
all these movies about, excuse me?
Flying cars and all those things.
Yes,
Yeah.
And that we would be in space, and we have these space stations by the 2020s.
Right.
And I'm so disappointed that, we as humanity have not, kind of made good on those promises. But I'm very hopeful in the future we will start to see that.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's fun to work with a team that is all working, towards that futuristic goal, and know that you're building the future.
It is, and to see the amount of passion that the team has, and they're just so engrossed in the entire process. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then as we start to wrap up, Kelly, one thing I'd love to hear from different executives is is there a favorite book that really served them well in their career or in their personal lives? Do you have a favorite one you'd like to share?
I do, though it's a little bit unconventional, and it's probably not your best example of a leadership book. So one of my favorite books is Catch-22. And I specifically like it because I think it adds humor to position to, I would say, absurd leadership individuals. And so I think all of us have had a leader that we were not thrilled about, or we thought was crazy or silly. And so getting through that, and maintaining a sense of humor and keeping your sanity and still learning, I think is very difficult to do. And so Catch-22 always gave me humor in those situations. And I was always able to find a character that matched the individual leader I was dealing with. And
Yeah, and
so
have a sense of humor
that
about
is,
it.
yes, exactly. And I could keep a sense of humor about it and kind of chuckle in my head and just keep going. And, it is temporary. And as long as I keep learning and keep my eye out, I can move on and be past
Yeah,
this. And so I think that's very important for people to know and understand in order to maintain the resilience you need in a
I
career.
love that. No, that's great. And then as we conclude in the last question, and I know you've shared a lot of great advice, is there one piece of advice that you would love to leave us with, as a chief operating officer, maybe it's to other CEOs or just other leaders in general that you like to end with?
So all of us have heard the phrase about knowing when to let things go. And, I think everybody hears that. But in my particular case, I would say it's not necessarily knowing when to let things go, but knowing when it's okay to lose. And specifically, I think a lot of folks who are in leadership tracks are high performing people who do not like to lose. And they don't like that to happen, and that's not how they got to where they are. But a lot of times that comes at the cost of winning a much larger, I would say, game.
Yeah.
And you don't realize it at the time because you're so focused on winning.
Yeah, that battle, not the
And
war.
in that battle, and you're not thinking far ahead to, does it make sense for me to just lose this one and pick it up somewhere else? And I would say throughout my career, I've known it, I've understood it, but in the moment, doing it and allowing it to happen is a skill, not necessarily a device, but picking up that skill. That being able to do that is incredibly worthwhile. And I'm still learning how to do it.
Right.
I'm still
Takes
getting
time.
good at it. But the sooner you figure out how to do that, the better.
That's a really interesting piece of advice to end with, because I'm sure it takes a little bit of humility and experience to recognize that this is not worth throwing more resources at it. And I know it'll look painful in the beginning, and maybe I don't look great in this situation, but it's the right thing long term.
No, you're 100% correct. I would say you're right. It is humility because, your pride does take a hit a lot of times when you do that.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of times hard to swallow.
Right. Especially in the short term. But yeah, that's good advice. Well, Kelly, so great having you on. Really excited what you and the team continue to build at Stoke Space, and you keep the famous tagline of being, I think, the fastest rocket company in the U.S. right now, and so excited to see a future where reusable rockets they're just rockets. That's just the norm. So thank you for what your team is building and sharing all of that on this podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been fun.
Awesome. Well, thanks you, Kelly.